his hand extended toward me while 300 princesses held their breath. And in that suspended moment, with crystal shards still pressed into my palms and his eyes burning through every wall I'd built around my heart, I understood that accepting would mean choosing a crown I never wanted, or refusing would mean losing the only man who ever truly saw me. The choice was mine, but the consequence belonged to us all. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning they announced the king's intentions, I was scrubbing blood from the stone steps of the Eastern Tower. Not my blood, never my blood, though there were days I wished for that mercy. It was deer blood, remnants of the previous night's hunt, and my hands were raw and red as I worked the bristled brush back and forth, until the grey stone remembered its original colour. The sun hadn't yet broken over the castle walls, and the air held that peculiar coldness that comes before dawn, the kind that settles in your bones and makes you wonder if warmth is just a dream you once had. I had been invisible for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist. 8 years in the castle, 8 years of moving through corridors like a ghost, of keeping my eyes down and my voice silent, of becoming so good at disappearing that even my own reflection seemed surprised to find me in the mirrors I polished. I was 17 when they brought me here, an orphan from the burned village on the border, one of 12 survivors, though I was the only one young enough, strong enough, deemed useful enough to serve. The others had been sent to the workhouses or the mines. I should have been grateful. That's what the head housekeeper told me on my first day. Be grateful, girl. You could be dead. Gratitude. Such a strange word for what I felt. More like resignation. More like the slow acceptance that this half-life was all I would ever know. But that morning, as I scrubbed and the castle began to wake around me, I heard whispers. They came in fragments, carried on the breath of passing servants, dropped like coins from the mouths of guards changing shifts. The king was finally choosing. After 3 years of refusing every match, every alliance, every carefully arranged meeting with princesses from distant kingdoms, he had agreed to a selection. A ball. A gathering of the most eligible noble daughters in the realm and beyond. 300 invitations had been sent. 300 acceptances received. The castle transformed over the following weeks. I watched it happen from the margins, from the shadows where I belonged. Seamstresses arrived with fabrics I couldn't name, silks that seemed to hold light, velvets deep as night, lace delicate as spiderwebs. Florists brought in flowers that shouldn't bloom in this season, their perfume so heavy it made my head ache. The kitchens worked day and night, and the scent of sugar and roasting meat filled every corner. Crystal chandeliers were lowered, cleaned, and raised again, each one glittering like captured stars. And the princesses came. They arrived in carriages that gleamed, in gowns that rustled with retinues of servants and guards and ladies-in-waiting. I saw them from windows as I worked, these creatures who seemed to belong to a different species entirely. They moved with certainty, with purpose, with the kind of confidence that comes from never once doubting your place in the world. Their laughter was like music, practiced and perfect. Their smiles never wavered even when their eyes were cold. I tried not to look at them. I tried not to feel the weight of comparison, the way my worn uniform and calloused hands marked me as something less than human in their eyes. But it was impossible. They made sure of that. "Watch where you're going, wretch!" one of them hissed at me when I nearly collided with her in a corridor. She was draped in emerald silk, her hair piled high and secured with jewels. When I stammered an apology, she laughed, not with humour, but with that particular cruelty that comes from knowing you'll never face consequences. "Do you even speak properly? Or just grunt like the animal you are?" Her companions giggled, a sound like breaking glass. I kept my eyes down, murmured another apology and hurried past. My face burned, my throat tight, but I didn't cry. I'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury I couldn't afford. The night of the ball arrived like a storm I'd been dreading. The entire castle pulsed with energy, with anticipation, with the collective breath of hundreds of people waiting for something momentous to happen. I was assigned to the ballroom itself, a punishment, though no one said so explicitly. While other servants could remain in the kitchens or the outer halls, I was to move through the crowd, invisible among the visible, collecting abandoned glasses and ensuring nothing disturbed the perfection of the evening. I dressed in my simplest uniform, the black dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely recognizable. My hair I pulled back severely. My face I washed until the skin felt raw. I wanted to be as unremarkable as possible to blend into the walls themselves. But when I entered the ballroom, I knew immediately that invisibility would be impossible. The room was vast, cathedral-ceilinged, lit by what seemed like 1,000 candles. The walls were covered in gilded mirrors that multiplied the light and the crowd until it seemed like the whole world was contained in this one space. The floor, polished marble, reflected everything like a still lake. And everywhere were the princesses. They filled the room like exotic birds, each one more elaborate than the last. Gowns of gold and silver and every jewel tone imaginable. Hair styled in impossible arrangements. Jewelry that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant fragments. They moved in carefully choreographed patterns, each one positioning herself for maximum visibility, maximum advantage. This wasn't just a ball. It was a battlefield, and they were warriors dressed in silk and diamonds. I pressed myself against the wall and tried to breathe. The orchestra began to play, and the princesses arranged themselves in a receiving line. That's when I felt the change in the air, that moment when the very atmosphere seems to hold its breath. The massive doors at the far end of the ballroom opened and he entered. I had seen the king before, of course. In the 3 years since he'd taken the throne, I'd glimpsed him in corridors, across courtyards, through windows. But I'd never been this close. Never been in the same room when his full attention was present. He was tall, taller than seemed possible, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight everyone insisted on placing there. His face was severe, all sharp angles and shadows, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His hair, black as midnight, was pulled back, revealing a face that was both beautiful and terrifying in its intensity. He wore black, unadorned except for a single insignia on his chest, the royal seal, but nothing else to mark his status. He didn't need it. Power radiated from him like heat from a flame. He moved into the room with slow deliberation, and every eye followed. The princesses straightened, preened, arranged their faces into expressions of demure interest. The air itself seemed to bend around him. And then, impossibly, his gaze swept the room and landed on me. It was like being struck by lightning. His eyes, those dark, fathomless eyes, found me against the wall, found me in my plain dress with my work-roughened hands and my too-thin frame, and something in his expression shifted. Not much, just a slight narrowing, a barely perceptible tilt of his head. But I felt it like a physical touch. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The moment passed, or seemed to, and his attention moved on. The chamberlain began announcing the princesses, calling each one forward to curtsy before the king, to be formally presented. They moved like dancers, each one executing perfect curtsies, offering perfect smiles, speaking in melodious voices about their kingdoms and their accomplishments. I should have looked away. Should have focused on my work, on collecting glasses from the tables along the edges of the room. But I couldn't. I was transfixed watching this ritual, watching the way each princess seemed to believe she might be the one, that her particular combination of beauty and lineage and grace would be enough to capture his interest. He remained impassive. He acknowledged each one with a slight nod, but his expression never changed. No warmth, no interest, nothing but that same distant, evaluating gaze. One by one, they were presented and dismissed, their hopes visibly deflating as they realized they'd made no impression. The presentations went on for what felt like hours. My feet ached from standing. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for abandoned glasses, careful not to make a sound that might draw attention. But I felt watched, examined. Every time I looked up, I caught glimpses of the king's gaze, and sometimes, it seemed to be resting on me. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was impossible, that a king would never look at a servant, especially not when surrounded by the finest noble daughters in the known world. But the feeling persisted. The formal presentations ended, and the dancing began. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and the princesses arranged themselves hopefully around the edges of the dance floor. The king was expected to choose a partner to begin the evening's festivities. The entire room held its breath. He remained motionless at the head of the room, surveying the crowd with that same unreadable expression. Minutes passed. The music continued, but no one dared to dance. The tension built until it felt like the air itself might shatter. Then he moved, not toward the princesses arranged so carefully before him, not toward any of the obvious choices. He walked directly across the ballroom, his steps echoing on the marble, and stopped in front of a cluster of princesses near where I stood. For a moment, I thought he was going to choose one of them, a stunning woman in silver who smiled up at him with predatory confidence. But he didn't stop. He moved past them, and suddenly he was standing directly in front of me. The ballroom went silent. Even the music seemed to falter and fade. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only stare up at him, at this man who suddenly seemed to fill my entire field of vision. "What is your name?" His voice was deep, rough-edged, and it went through me like a shock. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Around us, I could hear the whispers starting, could feel hundreds of eyes turning in our direction. The princesses were staring with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. The nobles looked scandalized. Even the servants had stopped their work to watch. "Your name," he repeated. And this time there was something almost gentle in his tone, though his expression remained stern. "Elena," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Elena Thorne, Your Majesty." He studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over my face with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen in a way I'd never experienced. Then he extended his hand. "Dance with me, Elena Thorne." It wasn't a question. It was a command. But there was something in the way he said it, some quality I couldn't name, that made it feel less like an order and more like an invitation to something dangerous and irrevocable. My hand was shaking as I placed it in his. His grip was firm, warm despite the leather of his gloves. He led me onto the dance floor, and the crowd parted like water. I was dimly aware of the gasps, the outraged whispers, the sound of someone, maybe several someones, beginning to protest. But the king didn't acknowledge any of it. His attention remained fixed on me. The orchestra, after a moment of confused silence, began to play again. A waltz, slow and haunting. I didn't know how to dance. Not like this. Not the formal dances of the court. But his hand on my waist guided me, his grip on my hand steady, and somehow my feet found the rhythm. We moved across the floor, and the room spun around us in a blur of light and color and shocked faces. "You're terrified," he observed, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Yes," I admitted. There seemed little point in lying. Of me? Of this, of them, of what happens when the music stops. His lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "What makes you think the music will stop?" I didn't have an answer to that. We continued to dance, and gradually, impossibly, some of the tension in my body began to ease. He was a skilled dancer, leading me with a certainty that made it easy to follow. And there was something in the way he held me. Not possessively, not roughly, but with a kind of careful attention that made me feel, for the first time in my life, like I mattered. The waltz ended. Another began. And another. He didn't release me, didn't look at anyone else. The message was clear even to me. He had made his choice. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices rose in protest, nobles calling out that this was improper, that it was beneath his station, that he was insulting every royal house present. The princesses, their carefully maintained composure cracking, began to cry out in outrage. I caught fragments of what they were saying. A servant. An orphan. This is madness. The king finally stopped dancing. He released my waist but kept hold of my hand, his grip tightening slightly as if he expected me to bolt. He turned to face the room, and his expression, which had been almost soft while we danced, hardened into something cold and absolute. Silence. The single word cut through the noise like a blade. The ballroom fell quiet so quickly it felt unnatural. Even the orchestra stopped playing mid-note. He stood there, still holding my hand, and surveyed the crowd with the kind of authority that made kingdoms fall. "I have listened to advisors tell me who I should marry," I have received delegations from every corner of the realm, each one certain they know what is best for this kingdom. I have been presented with 300 princesses, each one perfect in her lineage, her breeding, her accomplishments. He paused, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. And not one of them has ever looked at me as anything other than a crown to wear. The words landed like stones in still water. Several of the princesses gasped. Others looked away, their expressions a mix of shame and fury. The king continued, his voice never rising, but somehow filling the entire space. You offer me alliances built on ambition. You offer me partnerships based on political gain. You dress your daughters in silk and jewels and teach them to smile at precisely the right moments. But you forget something crucial. I am not a prize to be won. I am not a throne to be claimed through clever strategy and perfect curtsies. His hand tightened on mine, and I felt the weight of every eye in the room fixed on where we stood. For 3 years, I have watched this young woman move through these halls. I have seen how she works until her hands bleed. I have watched her show kindness to those who have none to spare for her. I have observed her resilience in the face of cruelty that would break most of your daughters within days. And I have seen something that none of you have offered me, genuine humanity unmarred by ambition. My throat was so tight I couldn't swallow. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. You call her a servant, the king said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You call her unworthy. You see only what she lacks rather than what she possesses. And in doing so, you reveal everything I need to know about your judgment and your values. He turned to me then, and his expression softened in a way that made my chest ache. Elena Thorne, will you accept my suit? Will you stand beside me, not as a servant, but as my equal? Will you let me prove that what I see in you is real? The world seemed to tilt. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. But his hand in mine was solid and warm, and his eyes held a question that was genuine, not performative. He was truly asking, truly waiting for my answer. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like falling, that my answer mattered to him in a way that nothing else in this room did. Yes, I whispered. Then louder, yes. The chaos that erupted was immediate and overwhelming. Voices shouting in protest, princesses crying, nobles demanding explanations. But through it all, the king pulled me close, his arm wrapping around my shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The ball is over, he announced to the room. You are all dismissed. Guards moved to clear the ballroom, and the guests, outraged, confused, scandalized, began to file out. Some of the princesses were weeping, others looked murderous. The nobles whispered furiously among themselves, but they went, because when a king speaks, even in disagreement, you obey. Within minutes, the ballroom was empty except for the king, myself, and a handful of guards stationed at the doors. The silence after such noise was almost painful. I stood there, still in my plain servant's dress, my hand still clasped in his, and tried to process what had just happened. It felt unreal, like a dream I might wake from at any moment. You don't have to go through with this, I said quietly. If you only did it to make a point, to rebel against their expectations, I'll understand. Eleanor. He said my name like it was something precious. Look at me, I did. Those dark eyes held mine with an intensity that stole my breath. I have never done anything to make a point, he said. Every action I take is deliberate. Every choice has weight, and choosing you, this was the most certain decision I have ever made. But you don't know me, I protested. You've watched me work, but that's not the same as knowing someone. What if I'm not what you think I am? He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Then we'll discover who you are together. But I know enough. I know that you have survived things that would destroy most people. I know that you have maintained your humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. I know that when you thought no one was watching, you showed kindness to a kitchen cat and spoke gently to a child who spilled wine on your dress. I know that you have never once looked at me with calculation or greed. That's more than enough foundation for what comes next. What comes next? The words hung in the air between us, full of promise and uncertainty. They'll hate me, I said. The nobles, the court, they'll never accept this. Let them hate, he replied simply. Their acceptance is not required, only yours. He was right in a way, but he couldn't understand what it was like to be hated by those with power over you. He was the king. He could command. I was still, despite everything, a girl who had spent her life at the mercy of others' whims. But I had said yes, and somehow standing there in that empty ballroom with his hand in mine, I couldn't regret it. The following days were a blur of unreality. I was moved from the servants' quarters to rooms in the royal wing, actual rooms with windows and furniture and space to breathe. Seamstresses arrived to measure me for proper clothing. The king's advisors appeared with barely concealed horror to explain protocol and expectations. And through it all, the king himself was there, checking on me, ensuring I wasn't overwhelmed, creating a buffer between me and those who would have preferred to see me thrown back into the obscurity from which I'd emerged. But the hatred was real and immediate. The servants who had once been my equals now looked at me with suspicion and resentment. The nobles made their disdain clear in every interaction, and the princesses who remained in the castle, unable to leave immediately due to the complexity of court protocol, were openly hostile. It was 3 days after the ball when I encountered Princess Marguerite in a corridor. She was one of the most beautiful of the noble daughters, with hair like spun gold and eyes like winter ice. She'd been considered a front-runner for the king's affections before the ball, and her fury at being passed over radiated from her like heat. "Well," she said when she saw me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The little servant girl, how does it feel to wear stolen glory?" I stopped walking, my heart rate quickening. "I didn't steal anything," I said quietly. "I didn't ask for any of this." "Oh, but you did," she replied, stepping closer. Her perfume was overwhelming, cloying. "You must have done something, used some tricks, some manipulation, because no man, no king, would choose someone like you over someone like me unless he'd been deceived." "Maybe he just wanted someone real," I said, surprised by my own boldness. Her hand moved faster than I expected, slapping me across the face with enough force to make my head snap to the side. The pain was sharp and immediate, bringing tears to my eyes. "You will learn your place," she hissed. "King's choice or not, you are nothing. You will always be nothing. And when he tires of this little experiment, you will be cast out with even less than you had before." She swept away, leaving me alone in the corridor with my burning cheek and my racing heart. I wanted to cry. Wanted to run back to the servants' quarters where at least I'd known what to expect. But instead I straightened my shoulders and continued walking. Because Marguerite was wrong about one thing, I had survived worse than her cruelty. And I would survive this too. That evening, the king came to my rooms. It was improper. I'd learned enough about court protocol to know that, but he seemed unconcerned with propriety. He took one look at my face, at the mark that still lingered from Marguerite's slap, and his expression went dark. "Who did this?" "It doesn't matter," I said quickly. "It's fine. I'm fine. It matters to me." His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Tell me who hurt you." I hesitated. I didn't want to be the kind of person who ran to him with every problem, who needed his protection for every slight. But the intensity in his eyes told me he wouldn't let this go. "Princess Marguerite," I admitted. "But please don't punish her. It will only make things worse." He studied me for a long moment and I couldn't read his expression. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, but understand this, Elena, you are not unprotected. You are not alone, and anyone who harms you will answer for it, whether you ask them to or not." There was comfort in those words, but also concern. I didn't want to be someone who needed defending. I wanted to be strong enough to stand on my own. As if reading my thoughts, he added, "Accepting help is not weakness, and standing beside me does not mean standing behind me. You have more strength than you give yourself credit for. I saw it the first time I watched you face down a noble who tried to trip you in a corridor. You didn't bow, didn't apologize for existing. You simply moved past as if they were beneath your notice. That strength, that's what I want beside me." I thought about that moment. I'd been so focused on surviving that I hadn't realized someone was watching, that someone had seen not weakness but resilience. Why me? I asked suddenly. Really, there must have been others who showed kindness, who worked hard. Why choose the one person who would cause the most upheaval? He moved closer, and I could feel the heat of him in the cool room. Because you never once looked at me and saw a crown. You saw a man. When I walked through corridors and caught your eye, you didn't curtsy or lower your gaze or perform deference. You looked at me as if I were simply another person sharing the space. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? I hadn't thought about it that way. To me, it had been survival, not drawing attention, not making myself a target. But to him, it had been something else entirely. I'm terrified, I admitted, of failing you. Of proving everyone right who says I don't belong. Then we'll be terrified together, he said softly. Because I'm terrified too. Of making the wrong choices. Of leading this kingdom into darkness. Of being the kind of king who values power over people. But fear doesn't mean we stop. It just means we move forward carefully. That night, lying in my new bed in my new rooms, I thought about everything that had changed in less than a week. I'd gone from invisible to inescapable. From servant to what exactly? The king's chosen. His intended. But not yet his wife, not yet his queen. Still in this liminal space where I belonged nowhere and was claimed by everywhere. Sleep was difficult. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold judgment. But eventually, exhaustion won. And I drifted into dreams that were strange and unsettling. Ballrooms filled with mirrors, hands reaching for me that I couldn't quite grasp, voices whispering words I couldn't understand. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that faced east, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back, and with it the weight of what I'd agreed to. A knock at my door made me freeze. "Come in," I called, my voice uncertain. A young woman entered, one of the ladies in waiting assigned to me by the king's steward. Her name was Beatrice, and she was one of the few who didn't look at me with open contempt. "Good morning, my lady," she said. "The king has requested your presence for breakfast." My lady. The title felt foreign in my ears. "I'll be ready shortly," I managed. She helped me dress, another strange experience being helped rather than helping. The gown they'd provided was simple but beautiful, a soft blue that reminded me of dawn skies. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The hollow-cheeked servant girl had been replaced by someone who looked almost like she belonged. Almost. The king's private dining room was smaller than I'd expected, intimate rather than grand. He stood when I entered, a gesture of respect that made my chest tight. "Good morning," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "Good morning, Your Majesty." "Kieran," he corrected. "When we're alone, call me Kieran." The name felt too intimate, too personal, but I nodded. Kieran. We ate breakfast together, and he asked me questions about my life before the castle, about the village I'd come from, about my family. It was strange talking about these things, excavating memories I'd tried to bury. But he listened with genuine interest, never interrupting, never judging. "You've lost so much," he said quietly when I'd finished telling him about the fire that had taken my family, my home, everything I'd known. "And yet you're still here, still standing." "I didn't have much choice," I replied. "You either survive or you don't." "There's always a choice," he said. "You could have let it break you. Let the grief and the pain turn you bitter and cruel. But you didn't. That's not lack of choice. That's strength of character." I wanted to believe him, wanted to see myself through his eyes. But it was hard to shake years of being told I was nothing, meant nothing, deserved nothing. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression becoming more serious. "The council has requested a formal meeting. They want to express their concerns about our engagement." "They want you to reconsider," I translated. "Yes, but I won't." He reached across the table and took my hand. "I need you to understand that. Whatever pressure they apply, whatever arguments they make, my decision is final. But I also need you to be prepared. They're going to question your suitability, your background, your education. They're going to try to find every reason why this shouldn't happen." My stomach dropped. "When?" "This afternoon. And I want you there." "What?" I pulled my hand back in alarm. "You can't. They'll tear me apart." "They'll try," he agreed. "But you're stronger than you think, and I need them to see that." I need them to understand that you're not some helpless girl I'm rescuing out of misplaced nobility. You're a woman who has survived impossible circumstances with grace and dignity intact. Show them that. I wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell him I couldn't face a room full of nobles who despised me. But the look in his eyes, the trust, the certainty made me pause. He believed I could do this. Maybe it was time I started believing it too. "All right," I whispered. "I'll be there." The council chamber was everything I'd feared. Vast, ornate, and filled with men who looked at me like I was an insect they wanted to crush. The king's council was composed of 12 nobles, each one representing different factions and territories within the kingdom. They sat in high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle, and I stood in the center of the room with the king beside me, feeling like a prisoner awaiting verdict. The head councillor, Lord Ravenscroft, a man with silver hair and eyes like flint, spoke first. "Your Majesty, we must express our grave concerns about this unprecedented decision." "Noted," the king said coolly, "but my decision stands. With respect, Your Majesty, you cannot simply dismiss centuries of tradition. A king must marry strategically. The queen must bring alliances, resources, legitimacy to the crown. This girl," he gestured at me dismissively, "brings nothing." "This woman," the king corrected, his voice sharpening, "brings integrity, intelligence, and resilience. Qualities I value far more than a dowry of gold or a treaty written on parchment." "But she has no education," another councillor interjected. "No training in statecraft, no understanding of governance. How can she possibly serve as queen?" "She can learn," the king replied, "as can anyone with intelligence and dedication. Or do you believe that nobility of birth automatically confers wisdom? Because I've seen plenty of evidence to the contrary in this very room." Several of the councillors shifted uncomfortably. Lord Ravenscroft leaned forward. "Your Majesty, we understand that you may feel affection for this girl, but affection is not enough to build a kingdom upon. The people need a queen they can respect, someone who represents the stability and tradition that holds our realm together. They need a king who doesn't treat them like cattle to be managed," I said suddenly, my voice cutting through his speech. The room went silent. Every eye turned to me. I felt the king's surprise, but also something else. Approval, perhaps. I'd stayed quiet throughout the proceedings, but something in Lord Ravenscroft's condescending tone had broken through my fear. "Excuse me?" Ravenscroft's voice was ice. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to continue. "You speak of what the people need as if you know them. As if you've ever gone hungry or worked until your hands bled or watched your family burn because no one thought you were important enough to save. I have. I know what the people need because I am one of them. And what they need is to know that their king sees them as more than numbers in a census or bodies to send to war." "How dare you?" another councillor began. But the king raised his hand. "Let her speak." I took a shaky breath. I don't pretend to understand politics or alliances. I don't know how to navigate court intrigue or negotiate treaties. But I understand something none of you seem to. That every person in this kingdom, from the lowest servant to the highest noble, deserves to be seen as human. Not as pawns, not as tools. And if I become queen, that's what I'll bring to the throne. Not gold or armies, but genuine care for the people you claim to govern. The silence that followed was absolute. I'd either destroyed any chance of acceptance, or I'd said something that resonated. I couldn't tell which. Finally, Lord Ravenscroft spoke, and his voice was quieter, more measured. "You speak boldly for someone in your position." "Because I have nothing left to lose," I replied. "You can dismiss me, reject me, send me back to the servants' quarters. But you can't make me less than I already am in your eyes. So yes, I speak boldly, because for the first time in my life, someone has given me permission to exist as more than a shadow." The king's hand found mine, his fingers interlacing with my own. The gesture was simple, but in this room, before these men, it was revolutionary. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you asked me to reconsider. I will not. Helena Thorne will be my queen with or without your blessing. But I suggest you give it, because the alternative is discovering just how little patience I have for those who stand in the way of what is right." There was no mistaking the steel in his voice, the implicit threat. The council exchanged glances, and I could see the calculation in their eyes. They could protest further, could make this a battle. But ultimately, the king's word was law, and opposing him too strongly risked their own positions. "Very well, Your Majesty," Ravencroft said finally, though his tone made it clear he was far from pleased. "We will support your decision, but we strongly advise that Lady Eleanor receive proper education and training before any formal coronation." "Agreed," the king said. "We'll announce the engagement publicly, but the wedding will not take place until Elena feels prepared. Does that satisfy your concerns?" It didn't. Their faces made that clear, but they nodded. What else could they do? As we left the chamber, my legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. But the king's hand remained steady on mine, keeping me upright, keeping me moving forward. "You were magnificent," he said once we were out of earshot. "I was terrified," I admitted. "Yes, but you spoke anyway. That's what courage is." The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my life, and also, paradoxically, the most fulfilling. My days became a blur of lessons: etiquette, history, politics, languages I'd never heard spoken. Tutors came and went, some patient, others clearly resentful at having to teach someone of my background. But I absorbed everything like I was starving, because in a way I was. Starving for knowledge, for understanding, for proof that I could become who the king believed me to be. The engagement was announced formally, and the kingdom's reaction was mixed. The common people, I was told, were largely supportive, or at least curious. A servant becoming queen appealed to something in them, a sense that perhaps the rigid hierarchies weren't as immovable as they'd always seemed. But the nobility was nearly unanimous in their disapproval. Delegations arrived at court to express their concerns. Allies threatened to reconsider treaties. There were even whispers of rebellion in the outer provinces. Through it all, Kieran remained unmoved. He dealt with each crisis with the same calm authority, never once suggesting that choosing me had been a mistake. And slowly, so slowly, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could do this. But not everyone was willing to accept the new reality. Princess Marguerite remained at court, ostensibly because her father was negotiating trade agreements, but really because she seemed determined to make my life miserable. She found countless small ways to undermine me, commenting on my accent, my manners, my dress. She gathered other discontented nobles around her, creating a faction within the court that made their opposition clear. It came to a head one evening at a formal dinner. I was seated beside Kieran at the high table, a position that still felt foreign and uncomfortable. The meal was proceeding normally when Marguerite, seated several places down, raised her voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Your Majesty, I'm curious, does Lady Eleanor understand the significance of the wine we're drinking? It's from the vineyards of Valdris, which have supplied the royal table for 3 centuries. I wonder if she can even taste the difference given her background." The table went silent. I felt the weight of expectation, the anticipation of my humiliation. My first instinct was to remain quiet, to not engage. But something in me, something that had been growing stronger these past weeks, refused. I set down my glass carefully and met Marguerite's gaze. "I can taste the difference," I said calmly. "This vintage has notes of black cherry and oak, with a slightly astringent finish that suggests it was aged perhaps 2 years too long. The 1247 vintage from these same vineyards, which I tried last week during my lessons in viticulture, was far superior, more balanced, with a complexity this one lacks." I saw the flash of surprise in Marguerite's eyes, the realization that I'd studied, that I was learning. Before she could respond, I continued. "But you know what I appreciate most about this wine, Princess? It's that the grapes were harvested by people whose hands looked like mine used to. People who worked from dawn to dusk to create something beautiful that they would never taste themselves. So yes, I understand the significance. Perhaps better than you ever could." The hall erupted in murmurs. Kieran's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently, support and pride evident in the gesture. Marguerite's face flushed red, but she had no response. She'd expected me to be ignorant, easy to mock. Instead, I'd not only demonstrated knowledge, but had turned her attack into a statement about the very class divisions she was trying to use against me. After that night, something shifted. I wasn't accepted. That would take far longer, if it ever happened at all. But I was respected, at least by some. I'd proven that I wasn't simply a king's whim, but someone capable of growth, of learning, of standing on my own. 3 months after the ball, Kieran took me to the royal gardens late one evening. It was our custom now, these quiet moments away from the pressures of court, where we could simply talk without the weight of titles and expectations. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small box. My breath caught. "Kieran, it's not what you think," he said with a slight smile. "Or not only what you think." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not the traditional royal engagement ring heavy with diamonds and history, but something simpler. A silver band inlaid with a single deep blue stone. "It's sapphire," he said, "from the eastern mountains near where your village once stood. I had it commissioned weeks ago, designed specifically for you. Not for a queen, not for a political alliance, but for Eleanor, the woman who challenged me to be better, who showed me that strength isn't always loud or obvious, who reminds me every day why I fight to make this kingdom something worth leading." Tears burned in my eyes. "It's beautiful." He took the ring from the box and held it up. "Eleanor Thorne, will you marry me? Not because I'm a king and need a queen, but because I'm a man who has found someone who makes him want to be worthy of her." I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The fire that took my family, the years of invisibility, the ball where everything changed, the struggles and lessons and small victories of the past months. And I thought about Kieran, this man who had seen past surfaces, past expectations, to something real underneath. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto my finger and it fit perfectly. Not too loose, not too tight, as if it had been made specifically for my hand, which, I realized, it had been. That night, walking back to the castle under stars that seemed impossibly bright, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the genuine hope of someone who believes the future might actually be beautiful. The wedding was planned for the following spring, enough time for me to complete my education, for the political tensions to ease somewhat, for the kingdom to adjust to the idea of a commoner queen. But the engagement itself was official now, and with it came new challenges and new opportunities. One of the most significant changes was in how the servants treated me. At first, they'd been suspicious, even resentful, but gradually, as they saw that I hadn't forgotten where I'd come from, that I still treated them with kindness and respect, attitudes began to shift. I made it a point to learn their names, to ask about their families, to ensure that working conditions in the castle improved. Small changes, better quarters, fair wages, time off for family emergencies, but changes that mattered. "You're making enemies among the nobles," Beatrice warned me one day as she helped me dress. "They see these reforms as setting a dangerous precedent." "Let them," I replied. "If treating people with basic dignity is dangerous, then perhaps the system needs to change." Word of these reforms spread beyond the castle walls. I began receiving letters, hundreds of them, from common people throughout the kingdom. They told me their stories, their struggles, their hopes, and I read every single one. Kieran found me one evening surrounded by piles of correspondence, my eyes red from reading. "You can't save everyone," he said gently. "No," I agreed. "But I can listen. I can witness. I can make sure their voices aren't lost in the machinery of governance." He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his entire face. "This is exactly why I chose you." But not everything was progress and hope. There were still those who wanted me gone, who saw me as a threat to their power and privilege. Marguerite had finally left court, but others had taken her place in the campaign to undermine me. Rumors circulated that I'd used witchcraft to ensnare the king, that I was plotting to eliminate the nobility, that I was secretly working with foreign powers to destabilize the kingdom. Most were easy to dismiss, but some stuck, creating doubts even among those who'd begun to support me. And then there was the incident with Lady Cordelia. She was an older noblewoman, related to half the royal houses in the realm, and she'd made no secret of her disdain for me. At a state function, She approached me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Lady Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "I've been meaning to ask, have you given thought to the royal lineage? After all, a queen's primary duty is producing heirs. I hope your common blood won't prove problematic in that regard." The implication was clear and cruel. I was fundamentally inferior, unable to fulfill even the most basic expectations of my role. Around us, conversations had stopped. Everyone was watching to see how I'd respond. I could feel my face burning, the old shame and anger rising. But I also felt something else. The months of lessons, of growth, of learning to stand in my own power. I looked Lady Cordelia directly in the eyes. "My blood is red, Lady Cordelia. Just like yours. Just like every person in this room. And I've learned that what matters isn't where blood comes from, but what the heart pumps it toward. Mine pumps toward justice, compassion, and the belief that every person in this kingdom deserves to be treated with dignity. If that's what you consider common, then I'm proud to claim it." I paused, then added more quietly, but still loud enough to be heard. "As for heirs, when the time comes, they'll be raised to understand that their worth comes not from their title, but from their character. Perhaps that's a lesson your own family could have benefited from." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. I'd not only defended myself, but had struck back, elegantly but unmistakably. Lady Cordelia's face went white with rage, but she had no response. She'd tried to embarrass me with cruelty disguised as concern, and I'd turned it back on her. Kieran appeared at my side almost immediately, his hand at my back, supportive but not rescuing. He'd let me handle it myself, trusted me to stand up for myself, and now he was making clear that we stood together. "I believe dinner is being served," he said calmly, but his eyes, as they passed over Lady Cordelia, were cold enough to freeze blood. That night became something of a turning point. Word spread of how I'd responded to Lady Cordelia, and opinions began to shift more favourably. I wasn't just a king's fancy or a political pawn. I was someone who could hold her own in the brutal world of court politics. But with visibility came increased danger. It started small, a piece of jewellery gone missing, a letter delivered to the wrong hands, food that made me sick. Each incident could be explained away as accident or coincidence, but together they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Kieran assigned guards specifically to me, which I hated. The constant surveillance, the loss of privacy. But after someone tampered with the bridle on my horse before a scheduled ride, nearly causing a serious accident, I stopped protesting. "Someone wants you dead," Kieran said bluntly that evening, his face drawn with worry and anger. "Or at least seriously hurt. We need to find out who." His spy network, something I'd learned about only recently, began investigating. What they uncovered was more complex than a simple assassination plot. There was a faction within the nobility, funded by foreign powers, who saw destabilization in the kingdom as an opportunity, that had been working to undermine Kieran's rule since he'd taken the throne. My presence and his insistence on marrying me had given them a rallying point. "They're using you as a symbol," the spy master explained during a tense meeting. "Proof that the king is losing touch with tradition, that he's putting personal desire over the kingdom's needs. They're fanning the flames of discontent, hoping to create enough pressure that he'll either have to give you up or face serious rebellion." "Then maybe I should," I started to say, but Kieran cut me off. "Don't even finish that sentence. You are not expendable. You are not a bargaining chip. We deal with this threat directly. But if I'm causing this much trouble..." "You're not causing anything," he said fiercely. "They are. They're the ones willing to destabilize a kingdom because they can't control who sits beside the throne. We don't give in to terrorists, Elena. We fight them." And fight we did. Kieran moved against the factions systematically, exposing their foreign funding, arresting those involved in the attempts on my life, making it clear that opposition was one thing, but treason would not be tolerated. It was brutal and necessary, and watching it happen taught me something about the reality of power. Sometimes maintaining peace requires showing strength. By the time winter arrived, the immediate threats had been neutralized, but the underlying tensions remained. There would always be those who opposed my presence, who saw me as an unwelcome change. I'd have to live with that, find ways to prove my worth not just to Kieran, but to the kingdom itself. The wedding was set for the first day of spring, symbolic, Kieran said, of new beginnings. The months leading up to it were filled with preparations that would have seemed fantastical to the girl who'd once scrubbed floors and collected glasses. I was fitted for a wedding gown that took 4 seamstresses 2 months to create. I learned the wedding ceremony from priests who were equal parts reverent and skeptical. I prepared speeches and studied precedents and tried not to feel overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what I was about to become. But through it all, Kieran was there, not just as the king who'd chosen me, but as a partner who listened to my fears, shared his own, and reminded me that we were in this together. The night before the wedding, he came to my chambers, breaking protocol again. But neither of us cared much for protocol anymore. We sat together on the balcony overlooking the gardens, watching the stars wheel overhead. "Are you afraid?" I asked him. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of marrying you, that's the only thing I'm certain about, but of all the rest, of being the king you deserve, of creating a kingdom worthy of your vision, of not letting you down." "You won't," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight, his face was softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen it. "How do you know?" "Because you care enough to be afraid," I replied. "Because you see me not as a crown or a symbol or a political statement, but as a person. And because despite everything, despite the pressure and the danger and the opposition, you've never once asked me to be anything other than myself." He reached out and took my hand, the sapphire ring on my finger catching the starlight. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "in front of the kingdom and the gods and everyone who's ever doubted us, I'm going to stand beside you and promise to love, honor, and support you for the rest of my life. And I want you to know those aren't just ceremonial words for me. They're truth, the truest thing I've ever said." Tears slipped down my cheeks, but for once they were happy tears. "I know," I whispered, "and I promise the same to you." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the sky that particular brilliant blue that seems designed specifically for momentous occasions. I woke early, too nervous and excited to sleep. Beatrice and a team of attendants arrived to help me prepare, and the next hours were a blur of activity, bathing, dressing, arranging my hair in an elaborate style that managed to be both elegant and authentic to who I was. When I finally looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The gown was ivory silk embroidered with silver thread in patterns of stars and flowers. My hair was crowned with a circlet of silver and sapphires. I looked like a queen, but more than that, I looked like myself, elevated but not transformed into someone I wasn't. The ceremony was held in the great cathedral, and as I walked down the aisle, I was aware of hundreds of eyes on me. But I kept my gaze forward, fixed on Kieran waiting for me at the altar. He was dressed in formal blacks and silvers, and when he saw me, his entire face lit up with a smile that was just for me. The ceremony itself passed in a dreamlike haze. I said the words, made the vows, felt the weight of the crown placed on my head by the high priest. And then Kieran was kissing me, and the cathedral erupted in cheers, and I was Queen Elena, a reality I still couldn't quite believe. The celebration that followed was magnificent and overwhelming. There was a feast that lasted hours, with dishes from every province in the kingdom. There was music and dancing and speeches, and through it all, Kieran never left my side, his hand in mine. His presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in this. As the evening wore on, I found myself standing on a balcony overlooking the crowd, nobles and commoners mingling in celebration, united for this one night by the joy of the occasion. Kieran joined me, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That a year ago I was invisible. I spent my days trying not to be noticed, not to take up space. And now..." I gestured at the celebration below, at the kingdom that was now partially mine to help guide. "Now I'm standing here as queen and everyone can see me. How does it feel?" I considered the question honestly. There was fear, still, fear of failing, of not being enough, of letting down those who believed in me. But there was also strength and purpose and the knowledge that I'd earned this position through resilience and growth, not through manipulation or chance. "It feels like belonging," I said finally. Not because of the crown or the title, but because I've found people who see me for who I am and believe I can become something even better. It feels like coming home to a place I never knew existed. He kissed my temple gently. Then welcome home, my queen. We stood there together as the celebration continued below, the future stretching out before us, full of challenges and possibilities. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more opposition, more struggles, more moments when I'd doubt myself. But I also knew I wouldn't face it alone. I had Kieran beside me, and I had found my own strength, the strength that had always been there, just waiting for someone to believe in it enough to call it forth. The story could have ended there, with the wedding, with the happily ever after that fairy tale's promise. But life is more complex than fairy tales, and the real work was only beginning. In the months and years that followed, I learned what it truly meant to be a queen. Not just to wear a crown and attend ceremonies, but to make decisions that affected thousands of lives, to balance competing interests and navigate complex political situations, to be a symbol while remaining human. I established programs to improve conditions for working people throughout the kingdom. Better wages, safer conditions, access to education for their children. The nobility resisted at first, but Kieran backed me completely, and gradually the changes took hold. We reformed the justice system to ensure that common people had real recourse against noble abuses. We invested in infrastructure that connected distant provinces, making the kingdom more unified. Not all of my initiatives succeeded. Some failed spectacularly. But I learned from each failure, adapted, tried again. And slowly the kingdom began to change. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in small increments that accumulated into real transformation. 3 years after our wedding, I gave birth to our first child, a daughter we named Aurora for the dawn. She was perfect, with Kieran's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. And holding her for the first time, I understood a new dimension of love and fear. This child would inherit a kingdom. The weight of that responsibility was staggering. But Aurora would grow up seeing a kingdom where birth didn't determine destiny entirely, where a queen could come from anywhere, where compassion and justice were valued alongside strength and tradition. That mattered. That was worth fighting for. I write this now, years after that night in the ballroom when everything changed. The girl who scrubbed floors and tried to be invisible feels like another person, someone I once knew but am no longer. I've grown, changed, become something I never imagined I could be. But I remember her. I remember what it felt like to be dismissed, to be told my existence didn't matter. And I use that memory every day in my work, in my decisions, in how I interact with everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest servant. Because the truth is, no one is truly invisible unless we allow them to be. Everyone has worth. Everyone deserves to be seen. And sometimes it takes someone who's been in the shadows to understand how to shine light into all the dark corners. This story, my story, isn't special because I became a queen. It's special because it shows that transformation is possible, that the systems that seem immovable can change. That one person's courage to stand up, to speak out, to demand better, can ripple out in ways we can't predict. If you're reading this and you feel invisible, if you feel like your voice doesn't matter, like you're just surviving rather than living, I want you to know you are seen. Your story matters. And the world needs people who've known darkness to help bring light. So I invite you to be part of this ongoing story, to believe that change is possible, to fight for a world where everyone, regardless of birth or circumstance, has the chance to be fully themselves. Leave your thoughts, share your own stories of transformation, and let's build something together. Because that's what community is. People choosing to see each other, to support each other, to lift each other up. The crown on my head is just metal and jewels. What matters is the crown we build together. The crown of justice, compassion, and shared humanity. Thank you for being part of this journey.